Thank you, Kalyana Prabha. That was really lovely. So good morning. I want to tell you a bit about the history of the complete works and who's been involved. And I'll say something about why it ends with a concordance and what a concordance is. And I'll reflect a bit on the existence of the complete works at all and what their value to us might be. In 2003, Bante made a will in which he requested his literary executors to bring out a complete uniform edition of all my writings, published and unpublished. And in response to this request, in 2013, Bante's literary executors met with Priyananda, who was then director of Windhorse Publications, to start planning what became Bante's complete works. And there was a great fundraising effort, and 9 years ago, more or less to the day, on this very spot, to celebrate Bante's 90th birthday, the sum raised was announced, accompanied by a great storm and a rainbow. So, in a meta moment in the complete works, Bante's description of that event is included in volume 26. The rainbows appeared on auspicious occasions throughout Bante's life. To find out more about that, you will be able to look up rainbows in the concordance. Yeah. Like so many projects, the complete works were possible because we didn't know when we started work on them that they were impossible. Financially, editorially, in scale, in scope, in every way. And so somehow they've happened, thanks to the belief and hard work of many people. They're a great credit to Windhorse Publications, led by Priyananda and then Dharmamega and all the team. It was such a huge project, challenging such a small publishing house. And there's Dharmarati's elegant designs, and Tara Jyoti's typesetting, which is often nothing short of heroic. You wouldn't think of heroic typesetting, but the volumes kept expanding. That was the thing. Because Bante kept writing, and we kept finding more material. So the word tally just kind of kept growing, and we had to keep reorganizing the volumes too. So their existence is also due to the commitment of their subscribers and the generosity of the people who supported them financially, including some donors who stepped in with extra funds to get them over the line at this last minute. And they also couldn't have happened without those who've done the editorial work. Kalyana Prabha, as well as helping plan the whole thing, edited a number of volumes, including some of the most difficult. Imagine that she worked on volume 1, the survey and the Noble Eightfold Path, followed by volume 2, which is the Three Jewels and a great many other works. They are both substantial and complicated. She did a lot of heroic work until she had to withdraw from the project because of her failing eyesight. And then Prabodhana took up the challenge and edited several volumes in his own very creative way. Then there's Shantavira, copy editing, and Kalyana Shri, proofreading, and they worked on every volume. Shantavira worked on the last one while he was doing his first round of chemotherapy, and he can't be here this weekend because he's doing the third round. Kalyana Shri, who also can't be here this weekend, is working on that very same volume at the moment, I think. And Sachi Leela took on indexing early on in the life of the project, and she worked wonders on Index Mountain, as she called it. So an early editorial decision was to include substantial endnotes to clarify sources and underpin Bante's words. This involved many hours in the library here, and we had the help of several of our scholars and experts. I particularly like to thank Divan for his help. Shradapa, Ratnaprabha, Vishvapani, Vasantara, and others made valuable contributions to different volumes. And Dharmotara was a great friend of the project. I particularly remember setting her the question, would it have been possible for the Buddha to have heard a lion roar? So for her answer to that, you can see volume 3, note 57. We got really excellent forewords. I'll tell you who's written the forewords. They are Subhuti, Nagabodhi, Parami, Kamala Sheila, Maitrivir Nagarjun, Savamitra, Mahamati, Vajratara, Divan, Ratnaguna, Vidyadevi, Abhaya, Buddhadasa, and Maitreya Bandhu, plus Kalyana Prabha and me. So I think a compilation of the forewords on their own would be quite a special overview of Bante's writings. Bante himself was very much involved in the project. from the planning and all the way through as far as he could until the very end of his life. He was a great help with endnote information. For example, I'd been searching for years and years and years, where did the Buddha say, test my teachings as the goldsmith tests gold in the fire, which was a favourite reference point of Bante's. It was Bante who finally gave me the clue as to where to find it. He lived to see the publication of the first 8 volumes of his complete works. I'm only sorry he couldn't see the rest. It hasn't been the same without him. So a lot of effort has gone into this impossible project, which has somehow been accomplished. But it's valid to ask why we need it. The world's changed a lot, even since the appearance of that rainbow 9 years ago. In our age, our sources of information are online, not in libraries. Our attention spans are shrinking, and the world increasingly communicates through sound bites and text messages. At the same time, we're drowning in a deluge of words. Search engines produce millions of words, informing or misinforming us on any subject imaginable. There's AI, which can now synthesize all this information to create or simulate writings in a way which could even apparently bypass the self-expression of human beings altogether. I have to admit, I was a bit relieved last week when an order member asked me where something was to be found in Bante's work, adding that it didn't seem to be in the volume ChatGPT had recommended. Which is not surprising, because it's not in that volume, as the concordance and I both knew. Added to all that, this is the time in which there's such sensitivity to the use of words. Culture wars are in progress. A UK commentator recently said that the country's evenly split on whether people are too easily offended or whether they should be more sensitive. And into this world comes this series of hefty physical books, although they also have a digital equivalent, with their old-fashioned vocabulary, written before any of this was happening. And in place of a search engine, they have such an old-fashioned means of finding information as a concordance, a word that dates back to the 14th century. Is this the time, I ask you? Well, you'd expect me to say yes, and I'm going to. So apart from the sheer pleasure of printed books, which I still feel myself, who knows, but perhaps this old-fashioned means of communication will turn out to be a gift for the future. As it happened, on the morning of Bante's death in 2018, I was visiting an exhibition of ancient books at the British Library in London, some dating back to the 5th century, and still quite legible. I emerged from the exhibition to check my emails and discovered that Bante had died just a few minutes before. And for me, that was a deeply meaningful moment, a kind of synchronicity, and it's continued to influence me. Maybe the printed word will outlast digital technology after all. Or at least it may prove important to have made this provision, in case it does, as I think Bante foresaw in his request to his literary executors. After all, I can't even access the words I trustingly stored on floppy disks 30 years ago. And I have to tell you that I couldn't print out the final version of this talk this morning because of a power cut. So this is the previous version. The written word endures, as Bante liked to quote. This brings to mind one of the endnotes it took me a long time to find, relating to the story of a time when a great king would send a man round the city on an elephant, proclaiming a reward of half the kingdom to anyone who knew even a single verse of the Dharma. But there would be no one to come forward to claim the reward, because not even a single verse of the Dharma would be remembered anymore, even for such a price. I eventually found the reference, quite by chance, in a work among the 100 books in the Sangha library. Those are the books that he brought back with him from India. And in a real sense, they're where the complete works start, I suppose. So as Dhammarathi was saying, words can't tell the whole story. Now, I recommend looking up words in the concordance for perspectives on this. But the words of the Dharma are precious nonetheless. And there's certainly a lot in the complete works that we could produce if anyone on an elephant came looking for them. But why did Bante produce quite so many words? And what are we to do with them all? I would answer the first question in 2 parts. The first is simply that Bante was a writer and he lived a long life. Late in his life, he wrote, "I've sometimes found it difficult to say whether I was a Buddhist who writes or a writer who was a Buddhist. In Complete Works Volume 22, he described starting writing the survey, accompanied by a rainbow, and experiencing a presence while writing. But even then, in the 1950s, someone said to him, "Why are you wasting your time on that old-fashioned stuff?" Bante says, "The unfeeling words pierced me to the quick." Bante also loved speaking about the Dharma. He wrote, "Communicating the Dharma was one of the great joys of my life, especially when the communication was through the medium of the spoken rather than the written word. And the talks he gave over many years form a substantial part of the Complete Works." He said, "For me, getting the feel of an audience was so tangible as to be almost physical." And once, he said, several members of the audience were on occasion in a state of evident shock, as if they had awakened from a dream and now saw the precipitous ascent, the loftiness of the peaks, the terrifying abysses. That sense of Bante's joy in communicating the Dharma takes us deeper into the reason why so many words. In fact, Bante, time and again, reminds us we need very little Dharma for the purposes of our own life and practice. Bante himself was a great reader. Perhaps he read too much, he once said, amazingly. But although, as he said, the nature of Buddhism is inevitably encyclopedic, a little can go a long way. Now, as it happens, the Complete Works themselves contain a lot of advice about how to keep our approach to the written word simple. If you look up more and more of less and less in the concordance, you find things like, "The essence of the Dharma for you can be contained in a single verse," and "If there's too much to practice, you end up not practicing anything," and "Our practice is not to fill ourselves with teachings, but to make ourselves fit to receive them." You could look up reading books on Buddhism under reading, or words and reality under words, or Dharma study as a practice under study, or advice for the Dharma student under teaching and learning the Dharma, for more perspectives on this theme. Bante also stresses the importance of being led by our own interests, not developing an exam mentality to approaching the Dharma. He reminds us that a question has to be a real question for you. Early in the history of the movement, when asked whether we yet have a view, a basic approach, that's like the historical schools of Buddhism are said to have had a view, he said, when paraphrasing his reflections, "Putting it in plain, direct, down-to-earth terms, we stress the primacy of experience over thoughts." So he was very alive to the limitations of words and concepts and the possibilities of expressing the Dharma in other ways. Having been somewhat overwhelmed by words myself over all these years, as you can imagine, I appreciate the bit in his 1970 retrospect when he said, "For a considerable period, I had been overwhelmed by a feeling that words had no meaning whatever. It was not simply that they were imprecise or clumsy or inept to express eternal verities, but quite literally they were devoid of any meaning." For someone like Bante, whose life was so utterly involved with words, that's quite something to say, isn't it? He goes on to say that, luckily, this feeling of the meaningless of words diminished in intensity, or perhaps I was able to cope with it better. He loved to quote, "We use words to get free from words until we reach the pure wordless essence." So again, that's what Dhammarati is talking about. But we don't just use these words for our own benefit. Bante also said, "If you know anything of the Dharma, pass it on to others, and learn the array of teachings to place them at others' disposal, and for your own benefit 2 or 3 teachings are enough, but you need more to help others." He even said, "You haven't really started practicing the Dharma until you've started giving it." This was clearly very much his own approach. He started writing articles about Buddhism when he was a teenager. He continued to write and teach throughout his life. He also clearly expected and encouraged his disciples to take that approach. Right from his early days in the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, he was running speakers' classes, and the section of concordance on giving Dharma talks is very long. No pressure, Bante. He expressed joy, great joy, at the publication of Buddhism for Today by Subhuti, which he said was the first full-size book on Buddhism to be written by somebody in the movement other than myself. It's kind of a handing on, if you like. Bante once told Nagabodhi, The forces at work in my personality were so powerful, so complex, so contradictory, that had I not discovered something as worthy of my commitment and devotion as the 3 jewels, I believe they would have ripped me apart. I honestly think I would have gone mad. And in one of his last essays, he wrote, "In the early days of the FWBO, I happened to be reading or writing about the myth in which Avalokiteshvara becomes the greatly compassionate one. As he contemplates the suffering of sentient beings, he's overwhelmed by compassion. So intense is the compassion, his head splits into 1,000 pieces. When I reached this point in the story," writes Bante, "I was very deeply affected. I started sobbing uncontrollably. In between my sobs, I kept crying out to the friend who was with me, 'His head split into 1,000 pieces. His head split into 1,000 pieces.'" Thinking about those 2 statements, my mind turns to the strange chance of Bante's name. On his ordination, he was at first named Dharmarakshita, and then, just because somebody else already had the name, he was called Sangharakshita. Bante says in his memoirs, "In this unceremonious manner was I placed under the special protection of the sangha, or spiritual community, rather than under that of the Dharma, or teaching." Reflecting on Bante's life as a whole, on those forces that might have ripped him apart, on that distress at Avalokiteshvara's 1,000 pieces, it seems to me that he needed to create a sangha to do what he couldn't do on his own. As he told us, he was under no illusion that he was the most suitable person to be the founder of a new Buddhist movement. But he had to. Got a couple of examples. Giving a talk in India in 1983, reminiscing about touring India in the 50s, Bante told his audience, "Although I gave so many lectures, I was not altogether satisfied with my work. Everywhere I went, I saw people who were suffering from all kinds of diseases and injuries. I used to think that it was not enough to preach the Dharma, not enough to look after the mind. We also have to look after the body. Sometimes I used to wish that I'd studied medicine instead of devoting so much time to poetry, philosophy, and history. I used to think how wonderful it would be if I could preach the Dharma in the morning and give medical treatment in the afternoon." Another time he said, "Since my return to England, I've sometimes wondered whether it might be a good or necessary thing to get involved in politics." Imagine that. Anyway, these are 2 examples. Bante could see and feel so much that needed doing, basically. The Buddha land has to be a joint creation, as he saw in his study of the Vimalakirti Nidesha. So no wonder he saw the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara as a symbol of the order. Collectively, we could do far more than he could on his own. And no wonder his hopes of what order members could do were so very high. Some of you will remember this, but he used to give hints in more or less any talk he was giving to the order. One year it was how we should learn another language. Another year it was how we should all study the classics. But he asked us to think of others, especially those who need the Dharma. He urged us to place greater emphasis on the Bodhisattva ideal. The section in the concordance listing Bante's advice for order members is just as long as his advice for Dharma speakers. So we have that legacy, we have that challenge. We have to consider self and other. So we follow the trail of breadcrumbs through the forest to find whatever we need ourselves, but we also help others to find their own way. So in Bante's writings and in telling the story of his life, that's what he's doing as well. And we're not trying to replicate his journey, we couldn't, but we could find our own and also help others find theirs. I think Bante's voice in his writings is so strong that it can be hard to hear that what he's often saying is to urge us to find our own voice, the voice within, he called it, or even the Darkani within. But, well, there are rather a lot of words. What are we to do with them? It occurs to me that just as the perfection of wisdom occurs in many forms, from 100,000 lines to 1 letter, Bante's teachings can be tackled in all their 26-volume glory. Or you could just pick up 1 aphorism, though you might need to be quite careful which aphorism you pick, I would suggest. Incidentally, in volume 26, where the aphorisms are, Ratnaprabha gives a really good introduction to how to approach aphorisms. Very interesting. But if our Not all of us are going to read all of it, clearly. For some of us, a few words will be enough. But if our Dharma life takes the form of communicating Bante's teachings to others, how are we going to place the array of teachings at others' disposal? How can we find what we need? Well, this is where the fabled concordance may help. So right at the very beginning of planning the complete works, I somehow knew they'd have to have what I, from the start, called a concordance. A concordance is defined as an alphabetical list of the words used in the works of a particular author, together with quotations to give the context in which the words are used. And that roughly describes our volume, though it's also a sort of encyclopedia, a sort of dictionary, a sort of collection of anthologies, an index, or something there's not really a word for, I think. Concordance also means the state of there being agreement or similarity between things. And that suits our volume, which brings together every aspect of Bante's writings, produced over more than 70 years. I don't know where that sense of mine that we'd need one came from, but when I corresponded with Bante about it, he said simply that a concordance is certainly needed. So that's not surprising. He was famously a great fan of reference books. He gained his own education from a set of encyclopedias, as we know, and he said that the dictionary is the most useful book in the world, leaving aside the scriptures. So I must say I'm really delighted that we've been able to give him his very own work of reference. Fantastic. But why is it certainly needed? Well, now that the Complete Works series is almost complete, the answer to that's a bit clearer to me. Next to me at my desk are 2 whole shelves of elegant published volumes, and even I feel a bit daunted, even though I know what's in all of them. So I can only imagine what it would feel like to approach them for the first time. So the concordance is designed to be a friendly guide, a way in, or rather thousands of ways. 1,000 doors fly open, Bante wrote in a poem about the Blue Cliff record. So whether you want to look up a person or a place, a Dharma term or a sutra, Padmasambhava or paganism, Dada Rinpoche or dancing, elephants or ethics, it'll all be there. And the entry may include a number of quotations from Bante's work to give you an idea of the range of material available, each with page numbers to relate it to the relevant volume. The quotations are often intriguing, but they're succinct, so they're no substitute for reading the whole passage. In my experience, when I open the book, that's sometimes like the moment when a black and white film becomes colour. So they're pointing the way, if you like, to the other volumes. So the aim was to include in the concordance reference to absolutely everything that's in the Complete Works. So working on it, I think makes me think of that story where somebody draws a map which ends up being at a scale of 1 to 1 and covers the entire country. It was hard to resist coming up with something like that. Although it isn't quite that big, the published book will be over 1,000 pages long, and organising it has been quite a feat and a very strong experience, which perhaps I'll try to explain in a minute. But how might we use it? I've got 3 suggestions. First, one might be looking for something very specific. Where does Bante say this? As you can imagine, I'm often asked that sort of question. That was on my mind when I worked on the concordance. I sometimes find that Bante, what he actually said, isn't quite what I remember him saying, but that can be useful too. And we often use that kind of information to give authority to something we want to say ourselves, which is quite valid. But there are other ways we could use a concordance. You can look to see what's there, not just hunt for a statement that supports what you already know you want to say. You could ask, what does Bante say about this? That might produce a range of possibilities, and occasionally they're even contradictory, which is always interesting. I like to give, I've given talks on this before, but an example I like to give is the answer to the question, what does Bante say is the central problem of the spiritual life? Is it, 1, finding emotional equivalents for our intellectual understanding, 2, conserving and unifying our energies, 3, how to translate knowledge into being, 4, that our knowledge is only superficial, we don't know in the depths, 5, when the means to enlightenment becomes an object of attachment. So, of course, it's a trick question, because Bante says at one time or another that each of those things is the central problem of the spiritual life. And we get a clue as to how that's possible in his reference to a term from Indian literature, prasamsa, which means eulogy. Bante says about that, a certain topic or quality or action is eulogized in order to draw attention to its extreme importance, but the eulogy is not intended to be taken perfectly literally. So in this sort of area, the sections of the concordance on contradictions, paradoxes, and literalism make interesting reading. Considering the range of what Bante said on the topic at different times and in different circumstances, that's instructive too. We can't just rest on one statement of what Bante said about this or that. Thirdly, the concordance allows us to consider Bante's work as a whole. It's gestalt, if you like. Gestalt being an organised whole that's perceived as being more than the sum of its parts. And I think we've never quite had this before. It's what I felt forming as I've worked on organising it, the sense of a whole pattern emerging. By the way, I did at one time think the production of the concordance should be a collective effort, but I quickly realised that collating a number of approaches and sensibilities into one thing with all its interconnectedness would have, been impossible or driven us mad, one or the other, which is why it's a solo effort with all the idiosyncrasies that means. So any one of you could have done it, would have come out different. I want to say more about the emerging pattern. It isn't easy to say briefly what I mean, but I'll give a simple example. If you look up animals, there are sections about kindness and cruelty, slaughter and sacrifice and hunting, the relationship between human beings and animals. There are all kinds of ethical and philosophical considerations. But also, the subject is traced through Bante's own life. From his love of animals as a small child, had a favourite toad on the con, to his support of a donkey charity in his old age. There are snippets of poems, from early ones about the plight of buffaloes on their way to market in Kalimpong, and the tender experience of sheltering from a storm during his wandering days in India, and waking to find a small white calf sleeping next to him. There's a later poem about the way songbirds are hunted in Italy, and an even later one apologising on behalf of humanity for the way we treat animals in the environment. A perspective from someone else, Dhammarakshita, in volume 10, remembers Bante on his tours of India in the 50s, gently removing insects from the ground where he was to sleep so that they wouldn't come to harm. So you feel how principle and practice are woven together with deep feeling. And from there, we could look up environment, perhaps, whereas as well as references to the Sutra of Golden Light, the first precept, the principle of non-violence, we find examples of environmental destruction in different places, and also Bante's belief that Buddhists need to play an active part in protecting the environment. And we see him playing an active part himself. In the 50s, we find him writing impassioned editorials in the Mahabodhi Journal, protesting against a plan for an irrigation scheme, which threatened an ancient Buddhist site. And this shows him exemplifying his strong belief that Buddhists should speak out in defense of their values. So from there, we could look up speech, or animism, or nature, and so on and so on. So perhaps that gives a bit of an idea of what I mean. It's a kind of crisscrossing of cross-references, kind of link it all up. It creates a sort of map of this gestalt, this world, I suppose. It's as though it's all folded together. Explanation and inspiration, poetry and prose, story and theory, word and image. It's a whole world. But at the same time, it brings Bante's words closer. There's a sort of intimacy about it. It's hard to describe it. When you see the work as a whole, you start to see that some topics are covered briefly, as though they were important or popular at a certain time, whether Bante was engaging with the interests of his audience or readership, or exploring an interest of his own. But others are visited very extensively. There are some stories and texts he returns to again and again. For instance, he often recounts his experience of talking to a young woman and discovering that her interest in the Anatta doctrine came from her self-hatred. And this was a touchstone for his conviction that thinking in terms of growth and development was what was needed in the West. So there are things he returns to again and again like that. Once when he was reminiscing about a realization he had in Kalimpong, he said, "There are a number of incidents in my career which have given me cause for reflection. It's these little things that one can really learn a lot from." I think that's quite a key characteristic of Bante, actually. there are some things that just stayed with him, this revisiting of moments of truth, you could say. But his interests were very broad, very deep, ever expanding, right to the end of his life, when he took to reading Carlo Rovelli and reflecting on Buddhism and Islam. There are some subjects on which he wrote at great length, which may now seem to us relatively unimportant. To take one example, there's much reflection on the relationship between lay Buddhists and monks and the monastic lay split. And now, for us, when our own ordination tradition is established and has been for years, it's easy to take that for granted. But Bante arrived at that ordination, the form it would take, after years of reflection on and experience of that existing tradition. It wasn't obvious. Maybe obvious now, it wasn't then. Bante wrote about it a lot. And to take another example, he reflected and wrote surprisingly extensively on Christianity. And considering that section as a whole, you can see the influences and experiences and writings that affected him and all their nuances. Did you know he was an admirer of John Wesley, for example? On the other hand, some topics that are current with us now don't feature much or at all in Bante's work. But we can't infer that that's because he wasn't interested in them. Also, the topics on which he wrote may have been limited to a particular time and a particular sensibility, though it was a long time and a vast sensibility. But there's also the way his work exemplifies and suggests the approaches we might take to any topic. So it's not just the substance of what he says, it's the manner of his approach. That's what we're learning, I think. In a previous talk on the complete works, I likened them to a cathedral. When I told Bante about that talk, he said, all order members need to know their way around the whole cathedral to be able to point out to others the particular features that they need to see. So that's the altruistic dimension I was talking about. But in that talk, having conjured up the image of the cathedral, its tower, its crypt, its peculiar gargoyles, I made it disappear, saying that rather than thinking of the complete works as something monumental and made of stone, or like a dusty relic of the past, we could see them as a growing forest. The complete works may be nearly complete, thank goodness, from one perspective, but really they will never be complete in the sense that they're still growing. What completes them is us, we might say. A very familiar saying of Bante's is that one that the order should not simply be Sangharakshita writ large. Avalokiteshvara has 1,000 hands. Each of 1,000 hands holds a different object. He says, we should allow our talents, attitudes, and capacities full scope. So the complete works are not just about what they contain in themselves, but how they inspire us to take them further. Paul Simon, the songwriter, says, the listener completes the song. It's we ourselves who complete them. They're beyond us yet ourselves, in the words of Wallace Stevens' poem. But, although they're not a fixed final thing, in a sense, they are something to go on, a foundation, a working basis. And now that they're there, now that those 1,000 doors are open, we can go through. We have these writings to review, criticize, use, enjoy, or disapprove of, whatever occurs to us. But they are our basis, and that's really the basis of the Adhisthana teaching community, I would say, too. A while ago, Satchalila and I did some work with women attending the Dharma Life course here, and we came up with a way of approaching Bante's work according to the pattern of the mandala of the 5 Buddhas. This was echoing, I think, the way the Essential Sangharakshita was organised according to that pattern. So what we came up with was, whatever you're reading, in the centre, you might put whatever's of deep personal interest. In the north will be anything you're puzzled by or don't understand. In the south, whatever makes sense to you or is in harmony with your experience. In the west could be anything you find very attractive, while in the east could be things you're repelled by or find difficult to accept. And that could be the basis of further exploration. I guess we might find ourselves naturally gravitating more to one of those realms than the others. But if you find yourself in the eastern realm, feeling repelled, perhaps bear in mind a saying of Bante's, before deciding you disagree with me, clarify your understanding of what I've said. On the other hand, you may be able sometimes to find your way to the western realm, deep enjoyment. Discussing literary criticism once, Bante said that the critic should enjoy what they're reading, He said, "By enjoyment, I mean the self-forgetful delight that comes when one surrenders to a work of literature and allows oneself to experience it with one's whole being, emotional and intellectual, sensitive and intuitive." He believed in immersing oneself in what one is reading and giving the words a chance to convince you, and only later applying your critical faculty. So the book reviews in Volume 8 exemplify that, I think. So that's my attempt to show you how the complete works, impossible but somehow existing, might be useful, and how the concordance might be a useful guide to them. So I should further tell you that the concordance, along with the last 2 volumes of the set, will be published in November, and that I would heartily recommend getting some, for yourself, for your centre, or both. But I don't feel comfortable with just making a case for how useful they are. True, they include much that is useful in the best sense, but also so much that's simply beautiful, or mysterious, or wonderful, or baffling, or troubling. Not because they're by Bante, or not just because of that, but because they're the Dharma. Perhaps that explains why I've cherished a particular painting as expressing my own sense of the complete works. So, as I said at the beginning of the talk, in 2013, I went to London to meet the other literary executors and Priyananda. That's what set us going on this journey. On the same trip, I went to a wonderful exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum on masterpieces of Chinese painting. And in that exhibition was a painting which I'm delighted to say will be reproduced on the cover of the concordance. Thank you, Damrati. Itinerant monk accompanied by a tiger. This strange image caught my imagination, and all these years I've identified it with working on the Complete Works project. So on the monk's back is a sort of rucksack in which he's evidently carrying precious Dharma teachings like those carried from India to China along the Silk Road in ancient times. From the sutras, incense smoke is rising. It's clearly a hard journey. The monk's face is creased with effort and sweat on his brow. And accompanying him quite closely, with steady stride and determined but crazy expression, is a tiger. So when I looked into this, I discovered that there are many similar images, and that they may even reflect the unlikely reality that monks really did travel accompanied by tame tigers. Who would have thought that? But somehow the image seemed to me important symbolically. When I told Bante about it, he smiled and said, "Vidyadevi identifies with the tiger," which is clearly true. In the context of the complete works, for me, the monk stands for the effort, the weight, the journey that carrying the complete works has been and will continue to be for all of us, whatever use we make of them or not. But the tiger represents whatever mysterious, playful but perilous element it is that accompanies our Dharma endeavour, the other element that appears out of the forest of being of its own accord to bless and support our efforts, something wild yet benevolent, a kind of bodhisattva spirit, I suppose, or a suprapersonal force, Bante might have said. So, all of our heartfelt thanks are due, not just to everyone who's contributed in any way, and there's more than I've said, to this complete uniform edition, and not even just to Bante, who produced this extraordinary body of work, but also to that mysterious spirit, that elusive tiger, who has accompanied us and accompanied him on this long journey.